I spent 10 years trying to forget the taste of her kiss in the rain. Tonight, that memory was violently replaced by the smell of her fresh blood on my floor. Sloane didn't come back to apologize for vanishing. She broke in, clutching a fatal wound, bringing a team of armed killers right to my doorstep. I'm a historian. I abhor violence. But as my front door began to splinter, she handed me her gun. Dust is predictable. It settles evenly across the intricate marble carvings of the Boston Public Library, obedient to the laws of gravity and time. I wiped a soft microfiber cloth along the edge of a Corinthian column in Bates Hall, keeping my breathing shallow. The scaffolding beneath my boots creaked slightly, a familiar sound in the vast vaulted silence of the reading room. It was past closing time on a Tuesday. Outside, the heavy traffic of Boylston Street was nothing more than a muffled hum against the thick stone walls. I adjusted my thin, silver-rimmed glasses, pushing a stray strand of my messy, low ponytail behind my ear. My oatmeal knit cardigan was already coated in a fine layer of white plaster dust, but I didn't mind the mess. Restoration work made sense to me. You find a fracture, you analyze the damage, and you apply the exact compound needed to make it whole again. There is a protocol for broken things. If only human history were that simple to patch up. My thumb brushed over a deep gouge in the marble, a scar left by decades of careless hands. It reminded me of the one flaw in my life I could never plaster over. 10 years. A full decade since the rain-soaked pavement of the Charles River Esplanade. We were 18, standing under the dim orange glow of a street lamp, the fabric of our graduation gowns clinging to our wet skin. Sloane had grabbed the lapels of my jacket, pulling me in with a desperate, crushing force. I remember the taste of cheap campus beer and the sudden, terrifying warmth of her mouth against mine. I remember the way my hands hovered in the damp air, too shocked to push her away, too terrified to hold her close. And then, she stepped back into the showers of the rain. When I woke up the next morning, her dorm room was stripped bare. No note on the mattress, no text on my phone, no forwarding address filed with the university. Sloane Gallagher had simply ceased to exist. I spent the next 3 years jumping at every ringing phone and scanning crowds for a glimpse of her signature collarbone-length bob. Eventually, survival instincts kicked in, and I learned to categorize her memory as an unsolvable anomaly. I built a life built on structure, routine, and historical preservation. I kept my emotional borders heavily guarded, preferring the cold predictability of inanimate objects over the chaotic variables of people. I reached for my trowel to apply the next layer of resin, my mind settling back into the quiet rhythm of the work. Then, the air in the room shifted. It wasn't a draft from the grand entrance on Dartmouth Street. It was a sudden localized drop in temperature, followed by a disruption in the sterile, papery scent of the library. It drifted up toward the scaffolding, sharp and unmistakable. Worn black leather, stale tobacco, crushed black pepper. My fingers went numb, and the metal trowel slipped from my grasp. It clattered against the wooden planks of the scaffold, the sharp metallic sound echoing violently across the empty reading room. I didn't move to pick it up. The muscles in my neck tightened, locking my gaze on the intricate ceiling frescoes above me. My rational mind immediately began constructing defenses. It's just an olfactory hallucination, brought on by the fatigue of a 10-hour shift. Scent is closely tied to the hippocampus, triggering involuntary memory retrieval. I squeezed my eyes shut behind my glasses. Logically speaking, I whispered to the empty air, trying to anchor myself, the building is locked. Marcus did his rounds 20 minutes ago. Marcus is easily distracted by a $20 bill and a sob story. The voice came from directly below me. It was lower than I remembered, raspy and laced with a lazy exhaustion, but the cadence was exactly the same. A cold shock traveled down my spine, rooting my boots to the wooden boards. I slowly turned my head and looked over the edge of the guardrail. She was standing in the center of the aisle, right between the rows of antique green reading lamps. Sloane. She looked up at me, a dim lighting catching those piercing, predatory green eyes. She was no longer the restless 18-year-old girl who had vanished into the rain. The lines of her jaw were sharper, her cheekbones more pronounced, carrying the weary weight of someone who had seen too much of the world. She wore a faded black leather jacket that looked like it had survived a war zone, and her collarbone-length hair was messy, unwashed. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched tight, humming with an electric friction that made the air feel suddenly thin. I gripped the metal railing of the scaffold, my knuckles turning white. "You shouldn't be in here," I managed to say, my voice sounding painfully thin and fragile. I hated how vulnerable I sounded, how quickly 10 years of carefully constructed armor cracked under her gaze. "I looked for you," I added, the accusation slipping out before my brain could filter it. "I know," Sloane said, not breaking eye contact. She didn't offer an apology, nor did she look away. She simply existed in my space again, demanding all the oxygen in the room. "Logically speaking, you can't just walk in here after a decade," I said, my tone growing defensive, trying to build a wall of words between us. "You vanished. You left no trace. I have a life now, a routine. You can't just—" "You're overthinking, Maya." Her use of my full name felt like a physical grip on the back of my neck. She took a slow step closer to the base of the scaffolding, stepping out of the shadows. That was when I noticed the dark, wet stains spreading across the lower left side of her gray t-shirt, just beneath the edge of the leather jacket. It wasn't rainwater. Sloane looked up at me, her green eyes utterly devoid of fear, but carrying a heavy, undeniable desperation. "I didn't come back to apologize for the kiss, Maya," she said, her voice dropping to a low murmur that somehow carried perfectly to my ears. "I came back because you're the only person in the world who knows how to hide things." She swayed slightly, her hand pressing hard against her side. "And right now," she whispered, looking over her shoulder toward the heavy oak doors, "I really need you to hide me." Blood does not belong in the Boston Public Library. It certainly did not belong on the pristine white cuffs of my oatmeal cardigan. But that was exactly where it ended up the moment I climbed down the scaffolding. I didn't ask questions. My brain, usually a meticulously organized filing cabinet of logic and historical facts, had effectively short-circuited. I grabbed Sloane's good arm, dragging it over my shoulder to bear a fraction of her weight. She was heavier than I expected, her body dense with a kind of hardened muscle that she definitely didn't possess at 18. The scent of her was overwhelming now. It was no longer just the ghost of old leather and tobacco. It was the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood mixed with the cold sweat of adrenaline. "Staff exit," I whispered, my voice sounding entirely unlike my own. "Dartmouth Street side." "Lead the way, Maya," she murmured, her breath warm against the side of my neck. Her voice was impossibly calm, completely devoid of the panic that was currently causing my own pulse to hammer violently against my collarbone. We navigated the shadows of the library corridors like criminals. I held my breath every time we passed a security camera, though Sloane didn't even bother to look at them. When we finally pushed through the heavy metal fire door and out into the freezing Boston night air, the shock of the cold nearly made my knees buckle. Sloane just leaned heavily against the brick wall of the alley, closing her eyes for a brief second. "My car is 3 blocks away," I said, fumbling blindly in my pockets for my keys. "Logically speaking, we should call an ambulance." Sloane opened her eyes, and the sheer intensity of her green gaze pinned me to the spot. "No hospitals," she commanded, her tone dropping into a terrifyingly quiet register. "No police. Just your car." I didn't argue. I couldn't. 10 years of absence hadn't diminished her absolute authority over the space between us. The walk to my sensible charcoal gray Volvo felt like a death march. I shoved her into the passenger seat, not caring about the blood that immediately began to soak into the upholstery. I slammed the door, ran to the driver's side, and started the engine with shaking hands. We drove in agonizing silence down Storrow Drive. The yellow glow of the streetlights washed over the interior of the car in rhythmic intervals, illuminating the pale, strained lines of Sloane's face. She was staring out the window at the dark expanse of the Charles River. "You drive a Volvo," she stated suddenly, her voice thick with an exhausted amusement. "Of course you drive a Volvo." I gripped the steering wheel until my joints ached. "It has an excellent safety rating," I snapped, keeping my eyes fixed rigidly on the road ahead. "Which is more than I can say for whatever lifestyle resulted in you bleeding out in my passenger seat." A low, dark chuckle escaped her lips, quickly followed by a sharp hiss of pain. "Still hiding behind statistics, Maya?" I didn't answer her. I focused entirely on navigating the narrow, cobblestone streets of Beacon Hill. My apartment was a third-floor walk-up in a historic brownstone, a sanctuary I had spent years curating to be perfectly silent and completely mine. Getting her up those 3 flights of stairs was a brutal ordeal. By the time I unlocked my front door and kicked it shut behind us, I was gasping for air. I steered her directly into the bathroom, ignoring the way her muddy boots tracked across my Ventus Persian runner. I sat her down on the edge of the porcelain bathtub. Under the harsh, clinical glare of the bathroom vanity lights, she looked even worse. Her skin was a translucent ashen gray, and the dark stain on her shirt had expanded drastically. "Take the jacket off," I ordered, trying to channel the authoritative tone of a project manager. Sloane just looked at me, a faint, mocking smile touching the corners of her pale lips. "You're going to have to help me, Maya," she whispered. "My left arm isn't really cooperating." I swallowed the dry lump in my throat. I stepped between her knees, the physical proximity instantly suffocating. My shaking hands reached out, grasping the heavy, worn leather of her collar. I carefully eased the jacket off her shoulders, sliding it down her arms. She let out a ragged breath as the leather peeled away from the wound, dropping the heavy garment onto the immaculate hexagonal tiles of the floor. The gray t-shirt was next. "I need scissors," I muttered, turning to open the medicine cabinet. I kept a fully stocked trauma kit in the apartment, a habit born from years of dealing with toxic chemicals and sharp tools in restoration work. I pulled out the heavy-duty shears and turned back to her. "I'm cutting it," I warned her. "Go ahead," she said, leaning her head back against the cool tiles of the wall, exposing the long, vulnerable line of her throat. "It's ruined anyway." I slid the cold metal of the scissors under the hem of her shirt, slicing upward through the blood-soaked fabric. When I peeled the ruined cloth away, the air left my lungs completely. It wasn't a bullet wound. It was a jagged, brutal laceration that started just below her ribs and sliced upward, a deep canyon of torn flesh that was still oozing sluggishly. But the fresh wound wasn't what paralyzed me. It was the landscape of her skin. 10 years ago, her skin had been flawless. Now, her torso was a map of violence. There was a pale, puckered burn scar near her collarbone, and a neat, circular mark on her right shoulder that looked terrifyingly like an old gunshot wound. "You're staring, Maya." Her voice cut through the sterile silence of the bathroom. I snapped my gaze up to her face. Her green eyes were wide open, tracking my every micro-expression with predatory precision. "What happened to you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The world happened," she replied smoothly, not breaking eye contact. "It tends to leave marks." I forced myself to look back at the bleeding laceration. "I need to clean it," I said, my voice hardening as I fell back into procedure. "It's going to hurt. I've had worse." I uncapped a bottle of surgical-grade antiseptic. I soaked a stack of sterile gauze pads and leaned in close. The moment the chemical-soaked cotton made contact with her open flesh, Sloane's entire body went rigid. Her jaw clenched so tight I heard her teeth grind, but she didn't make a single sound. Her right hand, however, shot out and clamped around my left wrist. Her grip was shockingly strong, her long fingers digging into my pulse point like a vice. I froze, the bloody gauze suspended in my hand. I looked down at her fingers wrapped around my wrist, then up into her eyes. She was breathing heavily through her nose, the scent of her sweat and distress filling the narrow space between us. "Don't stop," she gritted out, her eyes burning into mine. "Just give me a second." We stayed frozen in that position. My heart was beating so violently I was certain she could feel the rhythm of it pounding against her palm. The heat radiating from her skin was seeping into my cold hands. "You're shaking," she noted, her voice dropping lower, the pain seemingly giving way to something far more dangerous. "I'm not," I lied instantly, though my hand was trembling visibly. "You always were a terrible liar," she murmured. Her thumbs slowly, deliberately stroked over the wildly beating pulse at my wrist. The sensation was electric, a sudden, scorching line of fire traveling straight up my arm. I violently pulled my wrist out of her grasp. "Logically," I said, my voice shaking with an anger that was purely defensive. "You show up after a decade, bleeding on my floor, and expect me to be entirely calm?" Sloane just watched me, that infuriating, knowing look back in her eyes. "I expect you to patch me up," she said simply. "Because you fix broken things, Maya. It's what you do." The accuracy of the statement felt like a physical slap. I didn't reply. I aggressively cleaned the rest of the wound in silence, my movements swift and clinical, ignoring the soft hitches in her breath. I applied the surgical tape and secured a heavy pressure bandage over her ribs. When it was done, I stood up and took 2 large steps backward, putting a safe distance between us. "You need to tell me why you're here," I demanded, crossing my arms defensively over my chest. "Why you didn't go to a hospital? Who did this to you?" Sloane slowly pushed herself up to a standing position. She swayed slightly, leaning against the vanity, but she still managed to look entirely in control of the room. She reached into the front pocket of her jeans and pulled out a heavy, matte black Zippo lighter. She flipped the lid open. It didn't contain a flint or fuel. Snug inside the metal casing was a tiny, encrypted micro SD card. "I was in Berlin," Sloane said, her voice completely devoid of emotion, "documenting a private security firm operating out of a chemical plant. I took pictures of something I shouldn't have." "And they stabbed you?" I asked, the absurdity of the situation making my head spin. "No," she said dryly. "They tried to shoot me. I got stabbed by a local contact who decided the bounty on my head was worth more than our friendship." She snapped the lighter shut with a sharp, metallic click. "They tracked me to the airport. They tracked me to Boston." She looked up, her gaze locking onto mine. "They are highly motivated, Maya." "Then you can't stay here," I said, panic finally beginning to shatter my rational facade. "If they tracked you here—" "They lost me at South Station," Sloane interrupted, her tone absolute. "I made sure of it." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that this was just a temporary nightmare, and that tomorrow morning my life would return to its quiet, dusty perfection. I turned away from her, walking out of the bathroom and into my dark living room. I needed space. I needed to breathe without inhaling the scent of her. I walked over to the large bay window that overlooked the narrow, cobblestone street below. The antique street lamps cast a warm, orange glow over the empty sidewalks. It was 2:00 a.m. Bacon Hill was completely asleep. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness outside, a cold dread began to pool in the pit of my stomach. Parked directly across the street, beneath the heavy branches of an old elm tree, was a massive, matte black SUV. Its engine was off, but the faint, blue glow of a dashboard screen was visible through the heavily tinted driver's side window. Boston parking enforcement would have ticketed and towed a vehicle like that in this neighborhood an hour ago, unless it hadn't been parked there long. I felt a sudden shift in the air behind me. Sloane was standing right at my shoulder, moving with the terrifying silence of a ghost. I felt the heat of her body before she even spoke. "I told you," she whispered, her voice grazing my ear. "You're overthinking, Maya." She looked past me, down at the street. I felt her entire body tense, the relaxed arrogance vanishing in a fraction of a second. "Turn off the lights," Sloane commanded, her voice suddenly sharp as cracked ice. "Now!" I slammed my palm against the master switch on the wall. The antique brass lamps died instantly. The sudden darkness swallowed the apartment, leaving only the amber glow of the streetlights filtering through the wooden blinds. Before my eyes could adjust, a heavy hand grabbed the collar of my cardigan. Sloane pulled me down, forcing both of us to crouch below the window line. My knees hit the hardwood floor with a painful thud, but I didn't dare make a sound. We knelt in the narrow space between the window seat and the velvet sofa. It was a space built for one, but now it held two bodies tangled in a desperate, breathless knot. Sloane was pressed flush against my side, her right arm wrapping securely around my waist to keep me low. I could feel the violent, erratic hammering of her heart against my ribs. "Don't look over the ledge," she whispered, her lips brushing directly against the shell of my ear. Her breath was hot and ragged, a stark contrast to the freezing terror paralyzing my veins. "Who are they?" I demanded quietly, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to keep it clinical. "The kind of men who don't knock," she replied smoothly, shifting her weight slightly and wincing. The scent of fresh blood and surgical antiseptic flared between us again, thick and suffocating. I turned my head to look at her in the dim, striped shadows cast by the window blinds. Her face was inches from mine, her sharp jawline clenched in silent agony. Even bleeding and hunted, she carried that infuriating, unspoken arrogance. She wasn't looking at the window. She was looking at me. Those predatory green eyes traced the line of my throat, down to the rapid rise and fall of my chest. "You're hyperventilating, Maya." "I am breathing at a perfectly normal rate for someone whose apartment is currently being staked out by assassins," I hissed back. You let out a soft, dark chuckle that quickly died into a sharp hiss of pain. "They aren't assassins," Sloane murmured, her thumb absent-mindedly stroking the soft wool of my cardigan at my waist. "They're just highly aggressive, independent contractors." I grabbed her wrist, stopping the distracting movement of her hand. "Stop doing that," I snapped under my breath. "Doing what?" "Acting like you still own every room you walk into," I whispered fiercely. "You don't get to disappear for 10 years, bleed on my Persian rug, and then tell me how to breathe." The silence that followed was heavier than the darkness in the room. Sloane didn't pull her wrist out of my grasp. Instead, she leaped a fraction of an inch closer, erasing the final boundary of air between us. "I never claimed to own anything, Maya," she said, her voice dropping to a raw, gravelly register. "But you kept the door unlocked, didn't you?" The accusation hung in the air, sharp and uncomfortably accurate. I had kept my address listed in the alumni registry, a totally illogical decision I had justified as mere networking. "I didn't keep it unlocked for you," I lied, my voice tight. "Right," she whispered. "Logically speaking." She slowly twisted her hand, slipping her fingers out of my grip, only to interlace them perfectly with mine. Her palm was calloused and cold, but the touch sent a shockwave of adrenaline straight to my core. I tried to pull my hand away, but her grip was like iron. "We need to move," she stated, the momentary vulnerability vanishing from her tone, replaced by absolute command. "Move where?" I asked, finally surrendering my hand to hers. "There's only one staircase in this building." "They won't come through the front door," Sloane said, her eyes scanning the dark layout of my living room. "They'll use the fire escape on the alley side. It leads directly to your bedroom window." My blood ran cold. "How do you know the layout of my building?" Sloane finally looked away from me, her jaw tightening. "I've been in Boston for 3 days, Maya." The revelation hit me like a physical blow to the chest. She had been here for 3 days, watching me, mapping my routines, choosing the exact moment to shatter my perfectly constructed life. "You are unbelievable," I whispered, pulling my hand out of hers with a sudden violent yank. I scrambled backward, putting a yard of dark floorboard between us. "Get up," I ordered, pushing myself to my feet and grabbing her good arm to haul her up. "If they're coming through the bedroom, we need to leave through the front." Sloane groaned as she stood, leaning heavily against the wall for support. "We need a bag," she instructed, her breath hitching. "Passports, cash, medical supplies, whatever you have." "I am not going on the run with you," I stated, my voice shaking with a sudden fierce defiance. "I have a job. I have a life. I will call the police, and they will—" Before I could finish the sentence, Sloane moved with a terrifying, fluid speed. She crossed the distance between us in a single stride, her good hand slamming flat against the wall right beside my head. She pinned me in place, her body trapping me against the vintage wallpaper of my hallway. "Listen to me very carefully," she growled, all traces of exhaustion erased by a sudden, intense ferocity. "If you call the police, those men outside will slaughter them, and then they will kill you just for being in the same room as me." I stared up at her, my breath caught in my throat. The heat radiating from her body was overwhelming, an electric magnetic field that I couldn't escape. "You don't have a life anymore, Maya," she whispered fiercely, her green eyes burning into mine in the dark. "That life ended the moment I walked into the library." I wanted to push her away. I wanted to scream that she had no right to do this to me twice. But my body betrayed my logical mind, remaining perfectly still under her towering, dominant presence. "Why me?" I asked, my voice cracking, the 10-year-old question finally bleeding out into the open. "If you just needed a medic, you could have gone anywhere." Sloane stared down at me, the hard, aggressive lines of her face suddenly softening into something infinitely more dangerous. She slowly lowered her arm from the wall. Her knuckles gently grazed the side of my neck, right over my wildly beating pulse. "Because you're the only anchor I have left in this world," she breathed, her voice so quiet it felt like a secret. The touch of her knuckles against my skin felt like a lit match dropped on dry paper. Every logical defense I had spent 10 years building instantly vaporized. I closed my eyes, terrified of what she would see in mine if I looked back at her. "Pack a bag, Maya," she whispered gently, stepping back and breaking the spell. I opened my eyes, the cold air rushing back into the space she had just vacated. I turned without another word and walked down the dark hallway toward my bedroom. My movements were mechanical, driven by pure survival instinct. I grabbed my heavy canvas restoration tote, dumping out the delicate chisels and brushes onto the duvet. I threw in my emergency cash envelope, my passport from the bedside drawer, and the rest of the trauma kit from the bathroom. Sloane stood in the doorway, a dark silhouette leaning against the doorframe, watching me work. "We need to take the alley stairs down to the basement," I said, shoving a thick wool sweater into the bag and pulling the zipper shut. "There's an old coal chute that leads out to a different street." "Clever," she murmured. I slung the heavy canvas strap over my shoulder and turned to face her. "I'm only doing this because I don't want to be murdered in my own apartment," I stated coldly. "Whatever helps you sleep at night," Sloane replied, that infuriating ghost of a smile returning to her lips. She pushed off the doorframe and took a step toward me. But before she could take another, a sound echoed up from the center of the building. It wasn't a knock on my door. It wasn't the buzzer of the intercom system. It was the heavy, metallic screech of the downstairs security door being violently pried open. The sound resonated up the central stairwell, vibrating through the old floorboards beneath our feet. Sloane's head snapped toward the hallway, her entire posture shifting from exhausted to instantly lethal. She reached into the waistband of her jeans with her right hand, pulling out a compact black firearm I hadn't realized she was carrying. The metallic click of her disengaging the safety sounded deafening in the silence of my bedroom. "They didn't use the fire escape," Sloane whispered, stepping in front of me and raising the weapon toward the hallway. Heavy, methodical footsteps began to ascend the first flight of stairs. They weren't rushing. They were taking their time, the sound of their boots echoing with the terrifying confidence of predators who knew they had cornered their prey. "Stay exactly behind me," Sloane ordered, her voice completely devoid of warmth. "And whatever happens, do not close your eyes." The heavy thud of a boot striking my solid oak front door reverberated through the apartment. Wood splintered with a sharp, violent crack, the sound tearing through the quiet sanctuary I had spent a decade building. "The fire escape," Sloane ordered, her voice a harsh whisper. "Now." She didn't wait for my brain to process the command. Grabbing the collar of my cardigan with her good hand, she practically threw me backward into the bedroom. I stumbled in the dark, my hip catching the sharp edge of my antique vanity, but the pain barely registered over the deafening roar of my own heartbeat. Another massive crash echoed from the living room. The deadbolt was giving way. I scrambled toward the window, throwing the sash open with a desperate heave. The freezing Boston night air blasted into the room, biting at my face and instantly chilling the sweat on my neck. I climbed out onto the rusted iron grating of the fire escape, my boots slipping slightly on the frost-coated metal. Sloane followed right behind me, moving with an agonizing stiffness, but refusing to slow down. As soon as her boots hit the iron platform, she reached back and pulled the window shut, plunging us into the freezing shadows of the alleyway. Seconds later, the faint, muffled sound of my front door finally caving in echoed from inside the building. "Down," Sloane breathed, pressing a hand against my spine to push me forward. "Don't look back. Don't stop moving." We descended the zigzagging iron staircase as fast as her injury would allow. Every step sent a violent jolt of pain through her body. I could hear it in the sharp, ragged intake of her breath. But she kept her gun raised, her green eyes scanning the dark, narrow canyon of the alley below us. When we reached the second floor, the beam of a high-powered flashlight suddenly swept across the brick wall of the building next door. Someone was entering the alley from the street. "They split up," Sloane hissed, pulling me flat against the freezing brick wall of my building. We were trapped halfway down, exposed on the open iron grating. "The coal chute," I whispered frantically, my mind racing through the architectural blueprints of the brownstone. "It's directly beneath us. The grate is loose." "Go," she commanded. We crept down the final flight of stairs, the metal freezing my bare hands as I gripped the railing. I dropped into the narrow, trash-filled space between the building and the alley wall, wagging Sloane down with me. My fingers desperately clawed at the heavy iron grate set into the foundation of the building. It was old, rusted shut by decades of neglect, and for a terrifying second, it wouldn't budge. The beam of the flashlight swung closer, illuminating the dumpsters just 30 feet away. I let out a breathless sob of frustration, pulling with all my weight, ignoring the sharp iron tearing at my cuticles. With a grinding screech that sounded impossibly loud, the grate gave way. I slid feet first into the pitch-black void of the chute, reaching back to grab Sloane's leather jacket. She slid in after me, and together we reached up, dragging the heavy iron grate back into place, just as the flashlight beam washed over the exact spot we had been standing. We tumbled down the steep, slanted concrete shaft, landing in a tangled heap on the dirt floor of the old basement. The air down here was thick and suffocating, smelling of ancient damp earth, rotting wood, and the overwhelming metallic scent of Sloane's fresh blood. It was completely, utterly dark. I lay on the cold dirt, my lungs burning as I tried to muffle my gasping breaths. Above us, heavy footsteps crunched against the gravel of the alley. The faint light of the flashlight filtered through the small gaps in the iron grate, casting long, razor-thin shadows across Sloane's face. She was lying half on top of me, her left arm pinned between our bodies. Her forehead was resting against my collarbone, her breath hot and erratic against my skin. We stayed entirely frozen. I could feel the hard, unforgiving metal of her gun pressing into my ribs, a terrifying reminder of exactly what kind of reality she had dragged me into. The footsteps lingered right above the grate for what felt like hours. I squeezed my eyes shut, my entire body trembling uncontrollably, waiting for the grate to be ripped open and the bullets to start flying. But eventually, the footsteps began to recede, moving further down the alley toward the main street. The immediate threat faded, leaving behind an agonizing, suffocating silence in the dark basement. I didn't move. I couldn't move. The adrenaline crash hit me like a freight train, shattering the fragile, logical armor I had been desperately clinging to. 10 years of carefully constructed emotional borders dissolved in the damp, freezing air of that coal chute. I violently shoved at her heavy shoulders. "Get off me!" I choked out, my voice thick with a rage and terror I couldn't suppress anymore. Sloane groaned as I pushed her, rolling off my body and hitting the dirt floor with a heavy thud. I scrambled backward until my spine hit the damp brick wall of the foundation. I pulled my knees to my chest, wrapping my arms around them, trying to stop the violent shaking of my limbs. "You ruined it," I whispered, the words tearing out of my throat before I could stop them. "Keep your voice down," Sloane warned from the darkness, her tone laced with exhaustion. "No," I snapped, the volume of my voice rising dangerously. "No, you don't get to give me orders down here. You don't get to tell me what to do." I couldn't see her clearly, just the dark line of her body slumped against the opposite wall, but I could feel her gaze locking onto me. "I spent 10 years, Sloane," I said, my voice cracking, the tears I had refused to shed finally burning at the corners of my eyes. 10 years plastering over what you did to me. I built a quiet, perfect life. I made it safe. "Safe is an illusion, Maya," she replied smoothly, her voice a dark velvet purr that made my blood boil. "You just built a very pretty cage." "You abandoned me!" I hissed, throwing caution to the wind, the raw, blotting wound of my 18-year-old self fully exposed in the dark. "You kissed me, you set me on fire, and then you left me to burn alone in the rain. And now you come back, bleeding, hunted, and you drag me into the crossfire without even asking." The silence that followed was suffocating. I could hear the slow, deliberate sound of her shifting in the dirt, dragging herself upward until she was kneeling. Then she moved toward me. She was injured, bleeding, and exhausted, but the way she closed the distance between us in the pitch-black space was purely predatory. Before I could scramble away, her right hand shot out in the dark, finding the back of my neck with terrifying precision. Her long fingers curled into my messy hair, gripping firmly. She pulled me forward, off the brick wall, forcing me to lean into her space. Her face stopped just inches from mine. In the absolute darkness, I couldn't see her green eyes, but I could feel their immense, crushing weight pinning me down. "Do you think I left because I didn't want you?" she whispered fiercely, the lazy exhaustion entirely gone from her voice, replaced by a raw, vibrating intensity. My breath hitched in my throat. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even think. Her thumbs stroked the erratic pulse fluttering wildly at the base of my throat,
the touch burning hot against my freezing skin. "I left because I was a volatile, self-destructive disaster, Maya," she growled quietly, the words grazing my lips as she spoke. "And you were perfect. You were structured. You were art."
Her grip in my hair tightened just enough to make me gasp, sending a sharp thrill straight down my spine. "I walked away because if I stayed, I would have dragged you into the dark with me," she confessed, her voice dropping to a dangerous, possessive whisper. "And yet," I breathed, my logical mind completely short-circuiting under the sheer physical dominance of her touch. Here we are, she echoed softly. Her forehead rested gently against mine. The scent of her, the leather, the rain, the blood, and that intrinsic, undeniable essence of Sloane completely overwhelmed my senses. For 10 years I had convinced myself that I hated her, but in the damp darkness of that basement, with her hand firmly holding the back of my neck, the only thing I felt was a desperate, gravity-defying pull toward her. The air between our lips grew impossibly thin. I could feel the heat of her mouth. I could feel her hesitating, the rigid self-control of the Ice Queen finally cracking under the weight of a 10-year drought. I leaned forward, surrendering every logical defense I had left, my eyes fluttering shut. But before our lips could touch, a sharp, metallic click echoed directly above our heads. It wasn't a gunshot. It was the heavy iron grate of the coal chute being unlocked from the outside. Sloane's body went completely rigid. In a fraction of a second, the intoxicating, vulnerable woman vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, lethal operator. She released my neck, shoved me forcefully behind her back, and raised her weapon into the darkness just as a sliver of harsh, white light broke through the ceiling. "Maya," Sloane whispered, her voice dead entirely of emotion. "Run." The harsh, white beam of a tactical flashlight sliced through the darkness like a physical blade. It illuminated the swirling dust of the coal chute, casting erratic, terrifying shadows against the damp brick walls. "I said run," Sloane repeated, her voice an absolute, jagged command. She stepped fully in front of me, raising her weapon toward the grating, turning her own bleeding body into a human shield. I didn't move. Survival instinct is a highly unpredictable variable. For 10 years, mine had manifested as total avoidance, urging me to build walls and retreat from anything that could cause pain. But in that exact fraction of a second, staring at the defensive line of Sloane's shoulders, my instinct mutated into something reckless and fierce as possessive. Instead of retreating toward the basement stairs, my hand shot forward. I grabbed the thick leather of her jacket, my fingers curling violently into the material just below her shoulder blade. "I am not leaving you," I hissed, my voice cutting through the damp air with a razor-sharp finality I didn't know I possessed. Sloane whipped her head around, her green eyes flashing with genuine, unadulterated panic. "Maya, you are entirely out of your depth," she gritted out, trying to pry my fingers off her jacket without dropping her gun. "They will kill you, and you are bleeding to death in my basement," I shot back, tightening my grip. "Shut up and follow my lead." I didn't wait for her to argue. I pulled her hard to the left, away from the narrow beam of the flashlight that was now sweeping frantically across the dirt floor. I knew the architectural anatomy of this brownstone better than I knew my own reflection. It was built in 1892, originally heated by a massive coal furnace that connected to a subterranean network of municipal steam tunnels running beneath Beacon Hill. The access panel hadn't been used in 50 years, but I had documented its structural integrity during my renovation survey. I dragged Sloane through the pitch-black basement by memory alone, my free hand tracing the rough, freezing texture of the brick wall. Above us, the heavy iron grate shrieked as it was violently wrenched open.
The heavy thud of combat boots hitting the dirt floor of the chute echoed behind us. They were inside. My fingers finally brushed against a rusted iron latch hidden behind a stack of rotting wooden crates. "Here," I breathed, throwing my entire body weight against the heavy iron door. It screamed in protest, the rusted hinges grinding against each other with a deafening screech. The sound immediately drew the flashlight beam toward us. "Hey!" a rough male voice shouted from the darkness, followed instantly by the terrifying, mechanical clatter of a rifle being raised. "Get in!" I shoved Sloane through the narrow opening and threw myself in after her. I slammed the iron door shut just as a bullet sparked against the exterior metal, the impact vibrating straight through the ancient iron and into my bones. I threw the heavy deadbolt into place, securing the lock. We were plunged back into absolute darkness, but this space felt entirely different. The air was dense, suffocatingly hot, and smelled of sulfur and oxidizing metal. We were in the steam tunnels.
"Keep moving," I ordered, my breathing shallow and rapid. "This door won't hold them for long." I grabbed Sloane's hand, lacing my fingers through hers in the dark, pulling her forward into the narrow, low-ceilinged corridor. The ground beneath our feet was slick with condensation and strange, oily puddles. With every step we took, I could feel Sloane growing heavier, her weight dragging against my grip. Her steps, usually so silent and predatory, were becoming clumsy, her heavy boots scraping against the concrete. "Where does this go?" she asked, her voice tight, the smooth, arrogant cadence completely stripped away by the agony of her torn side. "It runs beneath Charles Street," I answered, keeping my voice low. "It connects to the old utility grid near the Common. If we can reach the maintenance hub, we can surface 3 blocks away." "You're a terrifyingly useful person, Meyer," she murmured, letting out a breath that sounded dangerously close to a wet cough. "Focus on walking," I snapped, though my thumb instinctively stroked the back of her cold hand in a desperate attempt to keep her anchored. We navigated the winding, oppressive darkness for what felt like miles. The distant, rhythmic dripping of water and the low hiss of ancient steam pipes were the only sounds masking our ragged breathing. The muffled echoes of our pursuers had faded, but the absence of noise only heightened the claustrophobic terror pressing in on us. Suddenly, Sloane stumbled. Her knees buckled and she pitched forward into the darkness. I caught her just before she hit the wet concrete, bearing the full brunt of her weight against my chest. She let a muffled groan of agony, her forehead dropping heavily against my shoulder. "Sloane," I whispered fiercely, struggling to keep us both upright. "Hey, look at me." She didn't respond immediately. Her breathing was erratic, shallow gasps that shuddered through her entire frame. I managed to guide us to the curved brick wall of the tunnel, letting her lean against it for support. I reached into my canvas tote in the dark, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I fumbled for my phone. I turned the screen brightness down to the lowest setting and activated the flashlight app, keeping my hand cupped over the lens to muffle the glow. The faint, blue-tinted light washed over her face, and my stomach plummeted. She was ghastly pale, a fine sheen of cold sweat clinging to her jawline and forehead. But it was the sight of her gray t-shirt that truly terrified me. The heavy pressure bandage I had applied less than an hour ago was completely saturated. Fresh, dark blood was seeping through the fabric, dripping steadily onto the muddy floor of the tunnel. She was hemorrhaging. "Turn the light off," she rasped, her eyes squeezed shut against the faint glare. "You're bleeding through the dressing," I said, my voice trembling with a panic I could no longer suppress. "I need to apply more pressure." "Maya, listen to me," she said, her voice dropping to a low, raw whisper.
She opened her eyes, and even in her severely weakened state, the intensity in her green gaze was piercing. She pushed herself off the wall, using her remaining strength to step directly into my space. She raised her blood-stained right hand, pressing it flat against the center of my chest, directly over my racing heart. "I cannot protect you down here," she stated, her tone devoid of its usual arrogant armor, leaving behind only a desperate, terrifying honesty. "I didn't ask you to," I replied, standing my ground, refusing to retreat a single inch. "You don't understand the machinery of the people hunting me," she continued, her fingers curling slightly against my sweater. "They don't leave loose ends. If you stay with me, you become a liability to them. And if I leave you down here, you become a corpse," I fired back, my voice hardening. The shift in our dynamic was sudden and absolute. For 10 years, she had been the ghost that haunted my periphery, the untouchable, unpredictable force that dictated the terms of our separation. Even bleeding on my bathroom floor, she had maintained the upper hand. But down here, in the suffocating heat of the Boston underground, her dominance was shattering. She was fragile. She was failing. And for the first time in my life, I realized I held the power to either save her or let her fall. I reached up and grabbed the wrist of the hand she had pressed against my chest. I didn't push it away. Instead, I stepped even closer, erasing the final boundary of air between us, forcing her to look down at me. "I stopped taking orders from you the night you vanished," I told her, my voice dropping to a dangerous, steady register. "You dragged me into this dark. You don't get to push me out just because you're scared of what happens next." Sloane stared down at me, her chest heaving, her green eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something entirely unreadable.
The Ice Queen was completely disarmed. She opened her mouth to argue, but the words died in her throat. Instead, a violent shudder racked her body, and her legs gave out completely. "Sloane!" I dropped my phone, grabbing her by the shoulders as she collapsed forward. We slid down the damp brick wall together in the dark, ending up on the wet concrete floor. I pulled her upper body into my lap, my hands instantly covered in the warm, terrifying stickiness of her blood. "Hey," I said, my voice cracking as I pressed both of my hands hard against her torn side, trying desperately to stem the bleeding. "Stay with me. Do not close your eyes." Sloane's head lolled back against my arm. Her eyelids fluttered, struggling to stay open, the piercing green of her irises dulling as shock began to take hold. "You're really angry," she mumbled, a faint, delirious ghost of a smile touching her pale lips. "I am furious," I choked out, tears finally spilling hot and fast down my cheeks in the dark. "So you have to stay awake so I can yell at you?" "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hissing steam pipes. "Just give me a minute." Her head tilted toward my chest, and her body went completely, terrifyingly limp in my arms. "Sloane," I begged, shaking her shoulder gently. "Sloane, wake up." There was no response. The silence of the subterranean tunnel pressed in on me, absolute and crushing. I was entirely alone in the dark, sitting in a pool of blood, holding the unconscious body of the woman I had spent 10 years trying to forget. And then, echoing from the long, dark corridor behind us, came the distinct metallic scrape of the iron door being breached. Panic is a luxury for the dying. As the metallic echo of the breached door reverberated down the tunnel, the last shred of my civilian panic simply evaporated. I gently laid Sloane's head onto the damp concrete floor. I picked up my phone, turning off the flashlight and plunging the tunnel back into absolute darkness. My eyes darted blindly, relying purely on the architectural blueprints etched into my memory. Just 10 feet ahead of us was a major junction in the municipal steam system, a bottleneck where 3 separate high-pressure conduits converged. I scrambled forward on my hands and knees, my palms slipping on the oily condensation of the floor. My fingers collided with a massive cast-iron rotary valve, its metal surface radiating a blistering heat. I gripped the wheel with both hands, ignoring the searing pain in my palms, and threw my entire body weight into turning it counterclockwise. It was rusted, resistant, demanding a violent, agonizing effort. From the far end of the corridor, the twin beams of tactical flashlights swept into the tunnel, illuminating the swirling mist. They were less than 50 yards away, their heavy boots splashing rhythmically through the puddles. I let out a raw, guttural scream of exertion and wrenched a heavy iron wheel one final, brutal rotation. A deafening, catastrophic hiss erupted from the joint overhead. Thick, scalding white vapor blasted downward with the force of a geyser, creating an impenetrable, boiling wall of steam perfectly bisecting the corridor. A shout of alarm echoed from the pursuers as the thermal shockwave forced them to aggressively backpedal. I didn't wait to see if it held. I spun around, sprinting back to Sloane's unconscious body. I hooked my arms under her armpits, lifting her upper half off the ground with a strength born entirely of adrenaline and pure, unadulterated terror. She was dead weight, her heavy leather jacket making her nearly impossible to drag. "Come on," I chanted silently through gritted teeth, pulling her backwards step by agonizing step. Just past the steam barrier was a heavy, reinforced steel door leading into an obsolete generator room, a relic from the early 000000. I kicked the heavy latch open and dragged her over the raised threshold. I pulled her entirely into the pitch-black room, threw my weight against the steel door, and slid the massive deadbolt home. The heavy metal completely severed the roar of the steam pipe outside, leaving us in a stifling, suffocating silence. The air in the generator room was stagnant, tasting heavily of copper and ancient dust. I collapsed onto the floor next to her, my lungs burning, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold my phone. I turned the screen back on, keeping it face down on the concrete to provide a dim, ambient glow. Sloane hadn't moved. Her face was terrifyingly slack, the sharp, aggressive lines of her jaw softened by the sheer gravity of blood loss. "No," I whispered, my voice breaking. "You don't get to check out yet." I straddled her hips, leaning completely over her torso to assess the damage. The pressure bandage was ruined, a sodden, useless mess of crimson. I needed to apply direct, massive pressure, but I had nothing left in the trauma kit. I didn't hesitate. I stripped off my ruined oatmeal cardigan, tossing it into the dark. I grabbed the hem of my cotton undershirt and pulled it over my head, leaving myself in only a thin sports bra in the freezing damp of the basement. I bundled the cotton fabric tightly, pressing it ruthlessly against the deep laceration on her side. I leaned my entire upper body weight onto my hands, driving the makeshift compress into her flesh to force the bleeding to stop. The agonizing pressure worked exactly as intended. Sloane's body arched violently off the floor, a raw, strangled gasp tearing from her throat. "Stay still," I ordered fiercely, my voice trembling, tears blurring my vision as I forced her shoulders back down with my forearms. Her eyelids fluttered open, the dim blue light catching the glassy, unfocused terror in her green eyes. She was disoriented, fighting against my grip like a cornered animal, her left hand blindly reaching up to grip my bare shoulder. "Maya!" she choked out, her fingers digging painfully into my skin. "I'm here," I sobbed, keeping the relentless pressure on her side, refusing to let her thrash. "I'm right here. Stop moving." It took a few agonizing seconds for the delirium to recede, for her mind to anchor itself to the reality of the dark room and the weight of my body pinning her down. She stared up at me, taking in my bare shoulders, the tear-streaked dirt on my face, and the desperate, violent grip I had on her life. A ragged, heavy sigh escaped her lips, and the tension slowly bled out of her muscles. "You're freezing," she whispered, her voice barely a thread of sound. "I am currently covered in your blood in a subterranean generator room," I fired back, my voice shaking with a volatile mix of relief and fury. "My thermal comfort is not the priority." She didn't smile. Instead, the defensive, arrogant armor of the Ice Queen completely dissolved, leaving behind a woman who looked devastatingly young and entirely shattered. Her right hand slowly slid from my shoulder, trailing up the column of my neck, until her cold, blood-stained fingers cupped my jaw. Her thumb gently wiped away a tear that had escaped down my cheek. "I never stopped looking at the weather in Boston," she confessed, her voice thick and gravelly. The admission hit me like a physical strike to the chest. "Every city I went to," Sloane continued, her thumb tracing the line of my lower lip, "every war zone, every godforsaken hotel room. I checked to see if it was raining where you were." I swallowed old, the lump in my throat making it nearly impossible to breathe. "You don't get to say that to me," I whisper fiercely, leaning into her touch despite every logical warning bell screaming in my head. "You don't get to rewrite history while you're bleeding out." "I'm not rewriting it," she breathed, her eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying absolute clarity. "I am just finally admitting it." The air between us grew unimaginably heavy. The metallic scent of blood was completely eclipsed by the immediate, overwhelming heat of her skin, the raw proximity of our bodies tangled in the dark. "You think you were the one waiting?" she asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate murmur that vibrated straight through my core. "You think you were the only one who drowned in that rain?" I couldn't speak. My hands were still desperately holding the compress against her side, pinning me to her, trapping us in a gravity well of our own making. "I walked away to keep you safe, Maya," she whispered, her fingers tangling into the messy hair at the nape of my neck, pulling my face an inch closer to hers. "I didn't want to be safe," I confessed, the ultimate truth finally tearing its way out of my chest, shattering 10 years of careful lies. "I just wanted you." Sloane let out a shaky breath, the sound mingling perfectly with my own. The space between our lips was practically non-existent, a microscopic boundary held together by 10 years of resentment and an ocean of unsaid words. She exerted a tiny fraction of pressure on the back of my neck, asking for permission without speaking a single word. I didn't pull away. I let my forehead rest against hers, my eyes fluttering shut, completely surrendering to the devastating pull of the woman beneath me. We existed in that suspended, agonizing moment, the silence of the room amplifying the erratic, frantic beating of our hearts. But the universe has a cruel sense of timing. Just as the ghost of her breath brushed against my lips, a sharp metallic scrape echoed from the other side of the heavy steel door. My eyes snapped open. Sloane's body went completely rigid beneath me, the fragile intimacy vanishing in a fraction of a second. Someone was standing right outside. The heavy brass handle of the deadbolted door slowly, methodically began to turn. The heavy brass handle of the steel door stopped turning. For 3 excruciating seconds, there was absolute silence on the other side of the metal. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the terrifying, coiled stillness of a predator assessing an obstacle. Sloane's right hand, slick with her own blood, blindly fumbled across the concrete floor until her fingers curled around the grip of her compact firearm. She tried to push herself up, to put herself between me and the door, but her muscles simply refused the command. She collapsed back onto the floor with a ragged, wet gasp. "Don't," I whispered fiercely, pressing my makeshift cotton compress harder against her side to keep her grounded. "They have a breaching charge," Sloane rasped, her green eyes fixed on the steel frame with a hollow, terminal clarity. "They won't bother picking the lock. They'll blow the hinges." As if to confirm her terrifying prediction, a rhythmic, metallic tapping echoed through the heavy door. They were setting the explosives. My rational mind, which had spent the last hour rapidly deteriorating, suddenly snapped back into a hyper-focused state of absolute clarity. Panic was useless. Logic was the only currency that mattered now. Internal combustion engines require massive amounts of air exchange, I muttered, my eyes sweeping desperately through the pitch-black room. I grabbed my phone from the floor, cupping my hand over the lens to narrow the beam of light, and pointed it at the massive, rusted silhouette of the antique generator dominating the center of the room. If this room housed a coal-fired generator, there has to be an exhaust flue or a sub-level cable trench, I said, my voice eerily calm despite the violent hammering of my heart. Maya, Sloane said, her voice dropping into a desperate pleading register that I had never heard from her before. You need to hide behind the iron casing of the generator. I ignored her. I left her side for a fraction of a second, crawling rapidly across the oily concrete toward the massive machine. My bare knees scraped painfully against the rough floor, but I didn't care. I swept the dim phone light along the base of the generator, searching the accumulation of century-old dust and debris. There, partially concealed beneath the shadow of the massive iron flywheel, was a heavy rectangular steel grate set flush into the floor. It was a cable routing trench, designed to run heavy copper wiring to the main city grid. I found it, I breathed, shoving my phone into the pocket of my jeans. I scrambled back to Sloane, hooking my hands under her shoulders and dragging her relentlessly across the floor. Stop, she groaned, her head rolling limply against my arm. Maya, it's too late. Just hide. I am not leaving this room without you, Sloane Gallagher, I hissed, my voice vibrating with an aggressive, territorial fury. Do not argue with me. I reached the grate, my hands slipping on the rusted metal as I tried to find a grip. I dug my fingernails under the edge of the heavy iron, ignoring the sharp pain as a nail cracked down the middle. With a guttural cry of sheer exhaustion, I heaved backward. The grate lifted with a grinding scream, exposing a narrow, pitch-black shaft that smelled intensely of ozone and stagnant water. A sharp electronic beep echoed from the other side of the steel door. The detonator was armed. Down, I ordered, grabbing Sloane by the collar of her jacket and practically shoving her feet first into the dark aperture. She slid down into the darkness, a suppressed cry of agony escaping her lips as her injured side scraped against the narrow concrete walls. I didn't have time to hesitate. I swung my legs into the hole and dropped down after her, reaching up blindly to grab the heavy iron grate. Just as my fingers wrapped around the rusted metal to pull it shut, the world exploded. The concussive shockwave of the breaching charge hit the steel door with the force of a freight train. The deafening roar of the blast ripped through the generator room, shaking the ancient foundation of the building. I yanked the iron grate down perfectly into place, just as a fireball of dust, heat, and shattered concrete swept over our heads. The noise was apocalyptic, ringing in my ears with a high-pitched, agonizing whine. I fell onto my back in the narrow subterranean trench, the air immediately choked with the acrid scent of C4 explosives and pulverized brick. We were in a space barely 3 feet wide and 3 feet high. It was a claustrophobic nightmare, a concrete coffin buried beneath the city. I scrabbled onto my hands and knees in the absolute darkness, frantically reaching out until my hands found the familiar heavy leather of Sloane's jacket. She was completely unresponsive. "Sloane," I choked out, my voice sounding distant and muffled over the ringing in my ears. I crawled forward, hovering directly over her body in the impossibly tight space. I pressed my ear against her chest, my own breath catching in my throat as I strained to listen. A faint, erratic heartbeat thumped sluggishly beneath her ribs. She was alive, but she was entirely out of time. Above us, the heavy crunch of combat boots echoed through the generator room. The beam of a high-powered flashlight sliced through the iron grate, illuminating the swirling dust in the trench inches from my face. "Clear," a harsh voice shouted from above. "They aren't here," another voice replied, the sound slightly muffled by the thick concrete ceiling. "Check the access panels." I didn't wait for them to find the grate. I grabbed the lapels of Sloane's jacket and began to crawl backward, dragging her dead weight through the claustrophobic tunnel. It was agonizing, grueling work. My bare shoulders scraped against the rough concrete walls, the skin peeling away, but the pain barely registered through the massive surge of adrenaline flooding my system. We moved inch by painful inch, retreating deeper into the forgotten arteries of Boston. The trench sloped downward, the air growing colder and damper the further we went. I lost all sense of time. It could have been 10 minutes or an hour of mindless, desperate crawling in the pitch black. Finally, the narrow walls of the trench gave way to an open, echoing void. I dragged Sloane out of the tunnel and collapsed onto a solid, cold stone floor. I lay there for a moment, gasping for air, the freezing dampness of the stone biting into my bare back. I pulled my phone from my pocket, the screen cracked but still functional, and turned the flashlight on. We had dropped into an abandoned, subterranean cistern. Massive brick archways disappeared into the shadows, supporting a vaulted ceiling dripping with condensation. In the center of the vast chamber was a dark, perfectly still pool of stagnant water. It was beautifully, terrifyingly quiet. "Sloane," I whispered, turning the dim light onto her face. She looked like a corpse. Her lips were completely bloodless, her skin a shocking, translucent white against the dark grime of the tunnel. I scrambled to her side, ripping a fresh strip of cotton from the remains of my undershirt to replace the soaked compress. As I pressed down on her wound, her eyes fluttered open. The predatory, untouchable aura of the woman who had haunted me for 10 years was completely gone. What remained was just Sloane, raw, broken, and looking at me with a vulnerability that completely shattered my heart. "You're shivering," she whispered, her hand moving weakly to touch my bare, freezing shoulder. "I'm fine," I lied, my teeth chattering uncontrollably as the adrenaline began to fade, leaving me exposed to the freezing underground air. "Take the jacket," she breathed, her fingers weakly tugging at the heavy leather lapel. "Stop it," I commanded gently, catching her hand and pressing it against my cheek. "You need to save your energy. Just look at me. Stay awake." She smiled, a faint, heartbreaking curve of her pale lips. "I'm looking at you, Maya," she murmured, her green eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that defied her physical state. "I haven't looked at anything else for 10 years. The admission tore through my chest, severing the last fragile thread of my emotional restraint. I leaned down, pressing my forehead against hers, my tears mixing with the blood and dirt on her face. "You don't get to die on me," I whispered fiercely against her skin. "You hear me? I will never forgive you if you leave me again." "I know," she breathed, her thumb weakly stroking my cheekbone. For a brief, suspended moment, the damp, freezing cistern felt like the safest place in the world. We were completely isolated, wrapped in a desperate intimacy that defied logic and survival. But the illusion of safety was brutally, instantly shattered. From the shadows of the brick archway directly across the cistern, a sharp, metallic click echoed through the vast chamber. My blood ran completely cold. A high-powered flashlight beam activated, pinning us both in a blinding, inescapable circle of white light. "End of the line, ladies," a calm, chillingly professional male voice echoed across the dark water.
He hadn't come through the tunnel. He knew the layout of the municipal grid and had simply flanked us, waiting in the dark for us to deliver ourselves to him. Sloane's entire body tensed. A sudden, violent surge of protective instinct flooded her dying frame. With a ragged, guttural cry, she violently pushed me behind her, trying to force herself upright. She raised her right hand, aiming her heavy black firearm directly at the blinding light. But her body was completely broken. Her hand shook violently, the heavy metal of the gun wavering wildly in the air. "Drop it," the man commanded from the darkness, the unmistakable sound of a rifle being shouldered echoing across the water. "Or I put a bullet in the pretty one first." Sloane let out a breathless sob of pure frustration.
Her finger tightened on the trigger, but her strength finally, utterly gave out. The heavy gun slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the stone floor with a dull, hollow clatter. She collapsed sideways onto the wet stone, completely paralyzed by exhaustion and blood loss. "Smart choice," the man sneered, the heavy footsteps of his combat boots echoing as he stepped out from beneath the archway, closing the distance between us. I looked down at Sloane, lying helpless and broken on the ground. I looked at the heavy black firearm resting on the stone just inches from my knee. For 28 years, I had been Maya Brooks. I was the historian, the restorer, the woman who adhered strictly to logic, protocol, and the preservation of beautiful, fragile things. I abhorred violence. I avoided conflict. But as the man raised his rifle, aiming it directly at the back of Sloane's head, my 10 years of careful, logical programming simply deleted itself. I didn't think. I moved. My hand shot out, my fingers wrapping securely around the cold, textured grip of the weapon. The grip of the weapon was textured, heavy, and freezing against my palm. It was the complete antithesis of the delicate, precise tools I used every single day of my life. For 28 years, my hands had been dedicated exclusively to the preservation of fragile things. I knew how to mend cracked marble, how to stabilize deteriorating canvas, and how to gently coax history back to life. I did not know how to end a life. I didn't know the proper stance, the correct breathing technique, or how to align the iron sights in the blinding glare of the flashlight. But I knew the basic mechanics of leverage, and I knew exactly where the center of mass was located behind that blinding white beam. I raised the heavy black metal with both hands, my arms locking rigidly as I pointed the barrel directly at the light. The man paused, the heavy crunch of his combat boots echoing to a halt across the wet stone floor. A harsh, echoing chuckle vibrated through the vast, vaulted chamber of the cistern. "You don't even know how to hold that," his voice mocked, laced with a chilling, arrogant amusement. A small, perfectly round red dot appeared on the skin of my bare shoulder, the laser sight of his rifle finding its mark. The red dot slowly, deliberately tracked across my collarbone, coming to rest squarely on the center of my chest, right over my racing heart. "Put it down, little girl," he sneered, stepping closer. "The safety is still engaged anyway." He was lying. My mind flashed back to the stifling darkness of my bedroom, to the terrifying, deafening click of Sloane disengaging the safety mechanism when the front door was breached. He was trying to make me hesitate, to buy himself the half-second he needed to pull his own trigger. I did not hesitate. I did not think about my career, my carefully structured life, or the moral abyss I was about to throw myself into. I simply looked at the red dot on my chest, thought about the bleeding woman lying behind me, and squeezed the trigger. The explosion of gunpowder in the enclosed, subterranean stone chamber was absolutely apocalyptic. The concussive boom shattered the silence, a physical shockwave that vibrated violently through the ancient bricks and into my teeth. The recoil was a brutal mechanical kick that snapped my wrists backward, tearing the delicate skin at the base of my thumb. I didn't close my eyes. The muzzle flash illuminated the vast cistern in a brilliant, terrifying strobe of yellow light. In that frozen fraction of a second, I saw the bullet shatter the lens of the high-powered flashlight. The blinding white beam vanished instantly, plunging the massive room back into chaotic, swirling shadows. A heavy, wet impact echoed sharply, followed immediately by a raw, guttural scream of absolute agony. The man staggered violently backward, the heavy rifle slipping from his grasp and clattering uselessly against the stone walkway. He lost his footing on the slick, condensation-coated edge of the platform. With a frantic, desperate thrashing of his arms, he tumbled backward into the void. The heavy, catastrophic splash of his body hitting the deep, stagnant water of the cistern echoed violently off the vaulted ceiling. Silence crashed back into the room, broken only by the frantic, echoing splashes of water in the dark. I kept the gun raised, my arms locked, pointing the smoking barrel into the pitch-black abyss. I listened to the violent thrashing of the water below. I listened to his muffled, desperate gasps for air as the freezing black water filled his lungs and dragged him down into the subterranean depths. The splashing grew weaker, more erratic, until finally, the surface of the pool grew terrifyingly, perfectly still. He was gone. I stood frozen in the suffocating silence, the smell of cordite and ozone burning the back of my throat. The adrenaline that had fueled my muscles suddenly evaporated, leaving behind a profound, paralyzing horror. I opened my hands, and the heavy black firearm slipped from my numb fingers. It hit the stone floor with a dull, hollow clatter that sounded like a judge's gavel falling in an empty courtroom. I stumbled backward, my bare knees hitting the freezing wet stone beside Sloane. I had crossed the line. I had completely, irreversibly shattered the pristine, logical world I had spent a decade building. I had blood on my hands, literally and metaphorically, and there was no chemical solvent in the world that could wash it away. I looked down at Sloane, my breath coming in shallow, hyperventilating gasps. She was staring up at me, her grey eyes wide and luminous in the dim, ambient glow of my fallen phone screen. She had witnessed every single second of it. She had seen the historian turn into a killer, all to protect the chaotic, destructive force that had ruined her life 10 years ago. The Ice Queen was looking at me with an expression of absolute, devastating awe. "Maya," she whispered, her voice barely a thread of sound, vibrating with a raw emotion I had never heard from her. "I fixed it," I choked out, my voice cracking violently as I frantically crawled closer to her. "I fixed the problem. He's gone." I reached out with trembling hands, pressing the soaked, ruined cotton compress back against her torn side. "You were art, Maya," Sloane breathed, a single tear escaping the corner of her eye and cutting a clean path through the grime on her cheek. Her cold, blood-stained fingers reached up, weakly wrapping around my wrist. "You were perfectly, flawlessly structured," she whispered, her voice fading rapidly. "And I just turned you into a weapon." "I chose to be a weapon," I sobbed, leaning over her, pressing my forehead fiercely against hers in the dark. "I chose it, so you are not allowed to feel guilty, and you are definitely not allowed to die." Sloane let out a ragged, shallow breath against my lips. "I love you," she murmured, the words slipping out with a terrifying, absolute finality. It wasn't a confession. It was a farewell. 10 years of waiting, 10 years of rutting, crystallized into 3 whispered words in the dark of an abandoned cistern. "Don't do that," I demanded, panic completely swallowing the remnants of my sanity. "Do not say that like it's the end. We just started." "It's cold," she whispered, her eyelids fluttering shut, the vibrant green of her irises disappearing behind pale, translucent skin. Her grip on my wrist suddenly went completely slack. Her hand slipped from my arm, falling heavily against the wet stone floor with a dull thud.
"Sloane!" I screamed, the sound tearing my throat, echoing wildly against the ancient brick archways above us. I grabbed her shoulders, shaking her with a desperate, frantic violence. Her head rolled limply to the side, completely unresponsive. I pressed my ear hard against her chest, my own tears falling onto her ruined gray t-shirt. The erratic, sluggish thumping of her heart had almost completely stopped. The silence between each beat stretched into an eternity. She was bleeding out, her core temperature dropping rapidly in the freezing subterranean air, and I had absolutely nothing left to save her. I had crossed the ultimate moral boundary. I had killed a man to protect her, and the universe was going to take her away from me anyway. "Help!" I screamed into the cavernous darkness, a primal, animalistic sound of pure despair. The echo of my own voice mocked me, returning from the shadows completely empty. We were buried 50 feet below the streets of Boston, surrounded by millions of gallons of black water and impenetrable stone walls. No one was coming. I pulled her limp, freezing body into my arms, wrapping my bare, shivering shoulders over her in a futile attempt to transfer my remaining body heat. I rocked her back and forth in the dark, my tears soaking into her collarbone, burying my face in the familiar scent of old leather and blood. The logical, rational part of my brain coldly calculated that she had less than 5 minutes left before complete organ failure. The emotional, shattered remains of my soul simply refused to let her go. I held her tightly against my chest, waiting for the final, devastating silence to fall. The human mind, under extreme trauma, abandons language. It retreats into basic, primitive sensory tracking. The wet, heavy weight of a dying woman in my arms, the freezing bite of stone against my bare knees, the smell of cordite and copper suffocating the oxygen in the ancient cistern. I didn't think about the man floating face down in the stagnant water just 30 feet away. I didn't think about the legal, moral, or psychological consequences of the smoking weapon resting on the stones beside me. I only tracked the spacing between Sloane's breaths. 4 seconds. 7 seconds. 10 seconds. "Don't you dare," I whispered into the hollow curve of her neck, my voice a broken, raspy thread. "Sloane, stay." My trembling, blood-slicked fingers clawed at the pocket of my jeans, retrieving the cracked screen of my phone. The battery icon flashed an agonizing 3%. But as the ambient light illuminated the ancient brick vaulting above us, my eyes caught a sequence of faded, stenciled white numbers on the concrete junction box directly overhead. MHBHL-409. It was a municipal utility marker, a specific geolocated node within the Boston water and sewage grade. I unlocked the screen with shaking hands, my cracked fingernails smearing dark crimson across the glass. I didn't call 911. A standard emergency dispatcher would spend 5 minutes trying to understand the logistics of an abandoned 19th century cistern. We didn't have 5 minutes. Instead, I opened the secure encrypted database of the Boston Historical Preservation Society, an administrative network I possessed executive override privileges for. I dropped the geolocated utility code into the automated emergency maintenance channel, appending a standard, catastrophic gas leak override protocol. It was a complete system manipulation, a deployment of city infrastructure under false pretenses that would trigger an immediate, high-priority emergency response to the street level, directly above this node. I added 3 words to the encrypted transmission note: trauma, compromised, basement. The phone screen flickered violently once, twice, and then died completely, leaving us in a heavy, absolute darkness. I dropped the lifeless plastic casing onto the stone. "I sent the flare," I whispered against her freezing cheek, my arms tightening around her limp torso. "They're coming, Sloane. You just have to hold on." She didn't answer. Her heart gave a single, painfully sluggish thud against my ribs, and then nothing. The silence that followed was an ocean, vast and terrifying, threatening to drown me completely. But 3 minutes later, a distant, rhythmic vibration shuddered through the ancient brick foundation. It wasn't the footsteps of the hunters. It was the deep, resonant wail of emergency sirens tearing down Cambridge Street, the sound bouncing through the narrow cobblestone avenues of Beacon Hill. Above us, heavy iron tools violently slammed against the street-level access hatch. "Down here!" I screamed with the absolute last remaining reserve of my physical strength, the sound tearing my vocal cords. "In the shaft! Down here!" Flashlights, bright, yellow, civilian searchlights, flooded the vaulting from an overhead access point I hadn't even seen. The rest of the night dissolved into a disjointed, chaotic blur of high-contrast imagery and sensory overload. The metallic clatter of an extraction basket descending into the cistern. Paramedics in high-visibility jackets cutting away the remainder of my blood-soaked undershirt to apply an occlusive chest seal. The rough, scratchy texture of a yellow wool shock blanket being draped over my bare, shivering shoulders. I refused to let go of her hand until they loaded the gurney into the back of the ambulance outside. We emerged into the blinding, frantic reality of a Boston thunderstorm. The rain was falling in thick, heavy sheets, washing the blood from my hands as the red and blue warning lights reflected off the wet pavement of Longfellow Bridge. It was the exact same rain from 10 years ago, but the girl who had stood terrified under the street lamp was completely, utterly gone. The waiting room at Massachusetts General Hospital smelled intensely of industrial lavender and cheap floor wax. It was 6:00 a.m. on a Wednesday. The vast, panoramic glass windows of the surgical wing overlooked the gray, churning waters of the Charles River. I sat rigidly on the edge of a Vinewood chair, still wrapped in the stiff hospital-issue scrubs they'd given me after the police took my statements. My hands were clean now. The skin was scrubbed raw, the cracked fingernails neatly bandaged, but the phantom weight of the firearm still lingered in the palm of my right hand. A detective from the Boston Police Department had questioned me for 2 hours. I had given him a perfectly logical, meticulously constructed narrative, a home invasion by unknown perpetrators, a desperate flight into the historic utility tunnels beneath my building, a catastrophic fall by one of the attackers into the deep cistern water. I left out the weapon. I left out the micro SD card hidden inside the Zippo lighter currently resting at the very bottom of my canvas tote bag. I played the part of the traumatized historical restorer perfectly. Because logic dictated that in order to protect the chaos, the structure had to lie. "Miss Brooks?" The soft, exhausted voice of the trauma surgeon shattered my trance. I snapped my head up, my silver-rimmed glasses slipping slightly down the bridge of my nose. The surgeon was pulling off her paper mask, her eyes carrying the deep, weary strain of a 6-hour procedure. "She's out of surgery," the doctor stated, a small, reassuring smile touching her lips. The laceration narrowly missed the renal artery. The blood loss was catastrophic, and she suffered severe hypothermia, but her heart is incredibly resilient. She's in the ICU. Stable. The breath left my lungs in a long, shuddering gasp. My forehead dropped into my hands, the hot tears finally spilling through my fingers, washing away the last lingering remnants of the dark basement. "Can I see her?" I choked out. "Briefly," the surgeon replied gently. "She's heavily sedated. She won't be awake for hours." The ICU room was entirely white, dominated by the rhythmic, artificial hum of life support machinery. Sloane lay in the center of the bed, her upper body swathed in heavy white bandages, her face still pale but carrying the soft, natural warmth of returning circulation. The signature collarbone-length bob was messy against the stark white pillow. Without the black leather jacket and the predatory green gaze, She looked strangely fragile, stripped of the dangerous armor she had used to keep the world at bay. I walked slowly to the side of the bed, the rubber soles of my hospital slippers squeaking against the linoleum floor. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly as I gently took her right hand. Her skin was warm now. The pulse at her wrist was steady, a rhythmic, beautiful confirmation that she was still anchored to this world. "You're a disaster, Sloane Gallagher," I whispered softly into the quiet room, a small, bittersweet smile touching my lips. A complete, illogical disaster. I leaned down, intending to press a soft, lingering kiss against the skin of her knuckles before leaving her to rest. But the moment my lips touched her skin, her fingers suddenly tightened around mine. My breath hitched in my throat. I snapped my gaze up to her face. Sloane's eyelids were open, the brilliant, predatory green of her irises completely clear, utterly devoid of the sedation the doctors claimed should have paralyzed her. She wasn't resting. She had been waiting. She didn't speak. She couldn't, with the supplemental oxygen cannula resting beneath her nose. But the lazy, arrogant intensity in her gaze was fully restored, pinning me to the spot with the exact same crushing force as the night she walked into Bates Hall. With a slow, deliberate movement that cost her a visible hitch in her breathing, her left hand reached under the hospital blanket. She pressed a small, folded piece of paper into the palm of my hand, her fingers curling my hand into a fist around it. She gave my hand a firm, communicative squeeze, and then slowly closed her eyes, letting her head sink back into the pillow as if she had finally accomplished her true objective. I stood frozen beside the bed, my heart hammering violently against my ribs once again. I stepped backward, away from the monitoring screens, and slowly unfolded the heavy cream-colored paper. It wasn't a medical document. It was a piece of stationery from a high-end hotel in Berlin, covered in Sloane's sharp, aggressive handwriting. "They know the cistern wasn't an accident, Maya. The micro SD card in your bag holds the transaction logs for the security firm's American buyers. Look at the third line item. The company that owns the matte black SUV also funds the historical society that pays your salary. The cage was never safe. The game has just changed. Are you ready to fix the rest of the world?" A cold dread pulled instantly in the pit of my stomach. I slowly turned my head, my eyes tracking toward the large panoramic window overlooking the hospital parking lot 4 floors below. The thunderstorm had passed, leaving behind a bleak, gray morning fog that clung to the trees along the Charles River. Parked directly beneath the street lamp at the edge of the emergency bay, its engine idling with a faint, almost imperceptible tremor through the glass, was a massive, matte black SUV. The driver's side window was heavily tinted, but as I watched, the blue glow of a dashboard screen illuminated the silhouette of a man looking directly up at the 4th-floor windows of the ICU. I looked down at the paper in my hand, then back at the sleeping, dangerous woman in the bed. The historical restorer I had been 24 hours ago would have panicked, called the detective, and begged for protection. But that woman had died in the cistern. I reached into the pocket of my scrubs, pulled out my lighter, and touched the flame to the corner of the paper. I watched the text curl into black ash, dropping into the metal wastebasket, my expression perfectly, flawlessly calm. Logically speaking, the structure was completely compromised, which meant it was time to tear the rest of it down. The rules of the game have changed, and Maya and Sloane's midnight escape is far from over. But we'll pause their story here for tonight. Before you slip away, I want to know where this rainstorm reached you. Drop a comment below and tell me, what city or country are you listening from right now?